Tazria begins. Dabra lemor isha ki Tazria v'olda zocher. So we skipped the first Rashi. The previous portion, Shmini spoke about the species that are classified as kosher species, whether it's domesticated animals, undomesticated, fish, birds, insects, whether it's land insects, water insects, whatever they may be. And we're going to discuss this in Makros. If you eat an insect, how many lavim are you in violation of? That was last week's reading. So first the Torah discusses the laws which pertain to the animal, which animals, which species are kosher, which are not kosher. And then in this portion, it discusses the laws which pertain directly to the laws of the person. A woman conceives, gives birth. What are the days of purity, the days of impurity? That's what's discussed. So, Ishki Sazri Omer Simloi Kishem Shivi Tzuroso Shel Odom Achav Kol Behema Chayvo B'Masa Bereishis. Just as the formation of man followed the formation, the creation of Chaya, Behema Chaya of Oaf in at the time of creation, came Kach Toroso Nisparsho. So the laws which pertain to man is articulated with the lineage Achat Torah Behema Chaya of Oaf. What's Reb Shmuel telling me? Just as the sequential order of creation was first the unintelligible creature, and then the human being, identically regarding the laws which pertain, first we discussed the laws, the classifications of the intelligible species, which are kosher, which are not kosher. Then we split up the laws which pertain directly to the person himself. I mean, this observation, what's the value of this observation? We find, and he says this in the portion of Bereshis, the sequential order was first God creates the earth. Then we have dry land and we have the land covered by water. And then we have vegetation. And then we have luminaries. And then we have species. And ultimately it ends with the human being. What does that say? So Rabbeinu Bachman says that clearly tells you that the human being is the center of the universe. He's the purpose of existence. Why? Because God first creates everything, all the amenities, all the necessities, to maintain the setting for man to function, to thrive, to address his objective. And then he brings the human being on the scene. Now, I present to you the challenges, and within this context, you have all your challenges. And everything's ready to go immediately. So because the human being was created at the end, he was the end of creation or formation, that indicates that everything that preceded him was only to facilitate and accommodate whatever his purpose was and is. So identically, what is the ultimate purpose of the human being? To serve Hashem. Now, who sets the script? Hashem sets the script. First, we speak about what's relevant to the unintelligible species. What's kosher, what's not kosher. We talk about them. How do we classify them? Afterwards, we speak about the human being, which pertains to him personally, how he has to behave, conduct himself regarding on the most intimate level, his laws, the laws of spiritual purity, conception, male, female, so on and so forth, and how to bring about atonement. You'd have to bring certain sacrifices. Certain times are permitted, certain times are not permitted. It's the same idea. So just as the objective is the man, the human being, and the confirmation that because he was the end, he was the last of creation, identically the laws, first we talk about how to understand the species, what's their value, and then we speak about your value on a personal level. That's the understanding. We'll see in a moment. Rashi doesn't bring the end of this midrash. The end of the midrash is Reb Shmuel says that just as the creation of the unintelligible species preceded the human being, identically the laws which pertain to them mentioned and delineated before the laws which pertain to the person. And if you don't appreciate that, you say to the person, Itush Kodmoch, the flea preceded you. Meaning, if you don't appreciate that everything that preceded you is to accommodate your purpose, every detail, every aspect of creation, you should know that you weren't created first. You should know, and the flea was created first, the flea has greater value, meaning you emanate from a flea. You know, the famous story of Yaakov Kamenetsky, he was Zechat Tzaddik Levrocha. He was about in his upper 80s, maybe 90 years old. He lived till the age of 95. He was traveling to Israel with his married granddaughter and grandson-in-law. They were traveling, and they were engaged in a conversation, literally unceasingly. They were talking to one another. And there was a man, an older man, on the plane, and he was observing this. And he goes up to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He says, it's unbelievable. He says, you know, I try to speak to my children. There's such a generation gap. My grandchildren, forget about it. How do you have such an intimate, common language with your grandchild, or they're even old, young enough to be a great-grandchildren? He says, I'll tell you the difference between me and you. He says, I believe we're creation of God. And therefore, where did they come from? Where do we, what's our origin? Our origin is God. And each was created with a purpose. And it all began at Sinai. He says, you people, you believe you come from the ape. So you being at an earlier generation, you're closer to the ape. I'm more advanced than the ape. If that's the case, what you have to tell me, I understand more than you understand. Therefore, we have no common language. But my grandchildren understand where I come from, that I'm a creation of God. And the early generation had a close relation with God. Therefore, they want to cull as much information of what that relationship was all about. That's what he answered this person. The same idea. The flea preceded us. Why? Evidently, the flea is necessary for creation. Every aspect of creation has a value, has a purpose. And all that's to facilitate the human being. That's what it was created. For an objective. What's the objective? To serve God. As a result of that, the flea preceding me doesn't mean to see the flea has greater value than me, just to the contrary. Every aspect of existence, every species of vegetation, whatever exists in existence, everything is only to accommodate my objective to meet my challenges. But if I don't believe it's all about challenges, everything's random. So if that's the case, if it's random, so why did you come about before the flea? So it doesn't say much about who you are, what your innate value is. Many years ago, I ran into asked me a question. This question was asked me close to 40 years ago. He asked me a question. He says, certain things don't make any sense. You have billions of people in this world. And Hashem wills and maintains this world 24/7, every moment, whatever it needs. And it's unlimited, what mankind needs. He says, at the end of the day, how many tzaddikim do you have? He says, you can count them on 2 fingers, relatively speaking. Does it make sense? That's the question he asked me. So what would you answer that question? It's like, you know, I'll use Mark's words. You have all these schlubs, all these guys hanging around here. What exactly is the value? Even you say, well, the Jews are special. What's the value of all these people? At the end of the day, God is maintaining them, underwriting them, supporting them, willing them. Well, it doesn't make any sense. What's it all about? He had, I don't know, 25,000 employees. I said, you own all these companies, you have 25,000 employees. And what is the value of all these people? You're running companies to give them salaries, to provide for their families. Is that why you're running these companies? Or because it's yourself, your wife, and you have 3 children? Their value is what? To make money to be able to support your family and to address your objectives and your values. That's the value. You get 25,000 people you have working for you for that purpose. It's lopsided. It's not lopsided. Because I understand my value, my children's value, and my values of values, it's all worth it. So I said, if you understand what one tzaddik is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's a pasuk the Gemara quotes, tzaddik yisod olam. That one tzaddik is the foundation of existence. It's worthwhile for Hashem to keep this world going from one tzaddik. So if you have more than one tzaddik, even though relatively speaking, you count them all on 2 fingers, doesn't make a difference. So all this existence, although Hashem knows most people are going to miss the boat, doesn't make a difference. But you have a world for those few tzaddikim. And as a result of that, it's all worthwhile. That's what it's all about. But Hashem there's a model. You have a flea and you have the sequence of creation. Unintelligible. And you start from the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, you have birds, you have everything. Then finally the human being. What does that tell you? So if you read the script right and you believe that the world has a value, has a purpose, and the purpose is doing the will of God, so then you understand the order of creation, the sequential order. All this is in place with an objective to accommodate ultimately the person who's the center of the universe. But if not, if it's all random and there's no specific purpose, and it's just survival of the fittest, factually, where did it all begin? It began with the flea. Maybe the flea has a greater value than you have. I want to mention the Chazal, the 3 most humble people who ever lived were Moshe, Avram, and David HaMelech. The most humble was Moshe. What did he say? Nachnu mo. Right? What am I? Nothing. Avram said, Anochi of Vever. When he entered into the dialogue, when he was informed that stone was being destroyed, he says, what am I? I'm ash, I'm dust, I'm nothing. And David says, Anochi tolev loish. I'm a worm, I'm not a person. I'm a worm. So I asked the question, I mean, if you want to really speak about how nothing you are, so a worm is this measly little creature. You should say, like Chazal used the term, Yitush kormach. I'm a flea. A flea is less than a worm. As an insect. Why does he use the term tolbas for the wish? I'm a tolbas, I'm a worm. So the reason why is this the order of humility? Nothing is nothing. Ash and dust, regardless of its worthlessness, it's still something. A worm, although it's measly, it's tiny, whatever it may be, but it's a living creature. It's more than dust. So that's the order of humility. But still, if you want to speak about how meaningless you are, you speak about a flea. I'm a flea. I'm not a person. What does he say? I'm a worm and not a person. So I explained in the past. Whenever I say explain the past, sometimes I thought Alan would pipe up and say, "Yeah, Rabbi, I remember what you said." So what I said, the Medrash cites a posuk that Yaakov is referred to as Tolbas Yaakov. Yaakov is referred to as a worm. We find that when Yaakov gave the bracha to Yosef, he says, "I conquered the Amori, the Kashtiu Becharbi, with my bow and with my sword." So over there, the Targum Onkelos explains what is Kashti, Bitzalusi Uvusi, with my prayer and with my supplication. Now, what a keshes is a bow. A sword is a sword. So Rameh Simcha of Devinsk explains it this way. At one time, a sword wasn't a dueling sword. When you used the sword in battle, the sword itself was a heavy piece of iron, which had a sharp edge on it. And just the weight of the sword itself would actually, you just had to apply a slight degree of pressure and it would destroy whatever it came in contact with. So the sword, in terms of its own weight, was able to bring about that level of destruction or death. A bow, how far does the arrow fly? It's all based upon how much power you put behind the arrow. That will determine how far that arrow flies. So he explains it this way with the Targum Onkelos. Tzlusi is the tefillah. That's the regular set tefillah. V'usi is tefillas nadava. We discussed in the past. Let's say a person, he's able to focus and have kavanah at the most minimal level. Do you say Shemona Esrei? You do say you say the Amida. Because Chazal, when they legislated 3 tefillas every day, in its own right, it carries its own weight. So even though you have a minimal amount of focus, it's good enough. If you want to add a tefillah, what's called a voluntary tefillah, in addition to the 3, you have to know in advance that you have the ability to focus from the first word to the last word. Otherwise, you're not permitted even to start adding that 4th tefillah. It's based upon your ability. If you have the ability, you say the voluntary tefillah. If not, you don't. The 3, you say regardless. So what is the 4th, the tefillas nadava based upon? Whether you have the ability or you don't have the ability. This is bekashti ubecharbi. The keshes is what you put into it. Charbi, the cherub, it's effective based on its own weight. It has its innate own value. It's able to destroy regardless of the power of the one who carries that sword. As long as he's able to apply it, the sword, basically based on its weight, is able to cut through, to destroy what it comes in contact. That's how Rameir Simcha explains Yaakov's words, Bekashtu bekarbi, charbi, with my bow and with my sword. So Medrash says, he doesn't bring this Medrash, Rameir Simcha says. Why is Yaakov called Tolas Yaakov? A worm as measly as it is. Now, what's the most majestic tree? The most majestic tree is the cedar, like the cedars of Lebanon. A worm, how could a worm topple a cedar? A worm has a certain enzyme in its saliva that when it starts picking and eating the base of the cedar tree, that saliva ultimately weakens the roots and the tree will topple. So its power, even though the worm is flexible and measly nothing, but where does its power lie? Its power lies in its mouth. Its saliva is actually ultimately brings about, topples the tree, the cedar. Tolas Yaakov, everything in Yaakov's life, this is Akol Kol Yaakov, everything is attributed to his tefillah. He took no credit for anything himself. Everything is Hashem. Why? It was due to his worthiness through his tefillah. That's why he's called Tolas Yaakov. Just as the worm, its effectiveness is through its mouth, although it seems to be nothing, identically, Yaakov is able to turn worlds and bring about results due to his power of tefillah. That's the mitzvah. Therefore, this is what David says. He conquered Israel. David Melchor Chai V'Kayo, whatever he was. Anochi Tolas Uish. I'm a worm. I'm not a person. It's not because I'm a man and who I am innately. It's because my power lies in my mouth. Everything I have, I attribute to my tefillah. That is Anochi Tolas Uish. I'm a worm. I'm not a person. So Yitush means that's the measliness of it. It's not talking about the measliness. It's about the worm in terms of what its effectiveness is, where its power lies. So that's humility. Is attributing nothing to himself, but everything to Hashem. One Jew will chase 1,000 of the enemy. In David HaMelech, when he went to war, he merited such divine assistance to be victorious. When he shot an arrow, one arrow, the arrow pierced 700 of the enemy. Could you imagine? It was like a tomahawk missile. It just kept going and going, went through one person, went through another. It killed 700 of the enemy. One arrow. It's miraculous. When David killed Goliath, David and the slingshot, David and Goliath. Do you think that whatever stone was in there, he wore a bronze helmet that must have been maybe 2 feet thick? The density of his bone structure, of his skull, how does that, whatever velocity he was able to throw that stone with that slingshot, how does it penetrate the bronze helmet go through his skull and go into his brain and kills him instantaneously. How does it happen? You know what the answer? It was a ness. He said Hashem Hashem. He said one name of God. He conjugated that, and because of the Chil Hashem to take place, he threw the stone. It was like putting. That stone went straight through the helmet, through his skull, right into his brain, killed him on the spot. So when he shot, David was disappointed with himself. He says, evidently, we're not towing the line fully. Because if we would tow the line fully, my arrow should pierce 1,000 people, 1,000 of them. It's only piercing only 700. So really, David himself felt he's really not where he should be as the king, as the leader of Klal Yisrael, because really his arrow should kill 1,000, not only 700. So we see clearly, and you read Tehillim, David's power was his mouth. That's what he meant. Anochi tolas luish. I'm a worm. I'm not a person. Scroll books. So the Beis HaLevi, he was a rav in a community called Slutsk originally. Slutsk. And in those days, if a person wanted a special son-in-law, and the man was wealthy, he would go to the rabbi and say, could you choose for me a special son-in-law? Has all the qualities, and I'm willing to support him for so many years, and eventually take him into business, whatever it is. So this is not a problem. I'll send you a young man to your home, and you'll meet him, and your daughter will be there. She'll see him, and he sent somebody. He wasn't a specimen of health. Wasn't a robust person, but he was an outstanding Chacham. Had all the qualities, the knowledge, the sterling character, but physically he didn't display that, the physicality. So he comes to the house. His daughter sees him. She looks at him. She's like taken aback. There's no way I'm going to marry this man. The father felt, if the rabbi says he has great potential, he's special, but he's not going to force anything on his daughter. So he goes to the rabbi and says, my daughter's looking for somebody else. Okay, no problem. I understand where your daughter's at. She's not interested in that. So where does he go? He goes to the butcher. And the butcher has a son who's about 100 pounds overweight. He's able to lift the side of beef. And he tells the butcher, tell your son to put on his Shabbos best. Let him go meet this girl. He walks in. He sees this coarse, ogre type look. So the father was like taken aback. He says, who did you send me? So the rabbi says, you said, the other man wasn't a specimen of health. This guy's the specimen of health. That's what you're looking for. You understand? But that's not what it's all about. Yeah. David HaMelech's power wasn't in his physicality. That's not where his power emanated from. It emanated from his mouth, from his Akol Kol Yaakov. Yaakov is Tolas Lovish. He's what? He's called Tolas Yaakov. Just as the worm, its power lies in its mouth. It's alive and ends on topples a cedar, identically the mouth of a Jew. If he prays and he's worthy, he could turn worlds upside down. Yom HaShmini Yimo B'Sara Loso. On the 8th day, you circumcise B'Sara Loso, the foreskin of his flesh. How do we know? The Gemara asks in Shabbos, how do we know that a child is born on Shabbos? How do we know Shabbos, that circumcision supersedes Shabbos, that you circumcise that child on Shabbos? Because the Torah says Ubishmini, on the 8th day. What's Ubayom Hashmini? The 8th day. So the Gemara says that even if the 8th day is Shabbos, circumcision supersedes that day. The Milah Docha Shabbos. And therefore you circumcise the child on Shabbos. Okay? So over here he explains that if a person doesn't circumcise himself, although it's a mitzvah saseh, the liability is what? The liability is kares. You only have two positive commandments. Every transgression of Kodesh is always being proactively negative. You cross lines. Milah and Korban Pesach are the only two positive commandments. In a passive state, because you were not proactive, you're liable for Kodesh. What exactly is the value of Milah? Removing that foreskin. So he explains over here, the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, when Hashem created, and I quote it, it's based on the Zohar. When Hashem created Adam, Adam was nearly a perfect person. He was the handiwork of God. He was created without a foreskin. Adam had no foreskin initially. And he was told by Hashem, you're permitted to eat from every tree of the garden, except one tree. The tree of knowledge, Eitz Hadas, which is Tov Ra. It's good and evil. That fruit contains within it evil, and therefore your being has no evil in it. It's pure. You can't allow that evil to enter into your existence, because if that would be the case, you become a finite person. Right now, you have relevance to the infinite. But if you allow that evil to enter into your existence, you'll become finite. The day you will eat of it, you'll be subject to death. Not that you'll die immediately, you'll be subject to death. Adam failed, he ate. When he ate of the Eitz Hadas, the Zohar says, he developed a foreskin. That's the foreskin. Now, who was given the mitzvah of Milah? Avram Avinu. Until Avram, there was no such thing as circumcision. And even if a person would circumcise himself, it was purely cosmetic. It had no value to affect the person, to impact the person's his state of spirituality. Avram Avinu, at the age of 99, because he met many challenges and he succeeded, disseminating monotheism throughout the world. And whatever he did, therefore he married a level of achievement within himself. Now he's ready for real time. By removing that foreskin, which is a consequence of the Eitz Hadas, the evil, that will impact on that. It'll minimize its influence on him and on his children. If you're not from his family, you circumcise yourself, doesn't have that effect. But if you're from Zera Avram, you're from his progeny, it'll make a difference. It'll minimize that effect. And will give you relevance. It'll open all the spiritual channels that exist within the person to have a relationship with Hashem. Otherwise, you're shut down. That's the mitzvah of Milah. So Milah circumcision is so vital to one's relation with Hashem. As long as you have that foreskin, which represents the evil of the Eitz Hadas, it interferes. It's an impediment to have that relationship. All channels are closed. When do those channels open and begin flowing? When you remove that foreskin. As a result of that, the value and importance of Milah is so important that it even supersedes the Shabbos for that reason. Okay? Now, there's a famous medrash. There was a dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and Tonis Troppis. Tonis Troppis was the Roman governor of Yerushalayim who ultimately put Rabbi Akiva to death. And they'd always debate issues. And Rabbi Akiva, they were philosophical issues. And Rabbi Akiva always made him look like a fool, which was understandable. Just that Rabbi Akiva's intellectual capacity was beyond, we can't even relate to what it was. And this Tonis Troppis put a question to Rabbi Akiva and asked him, whose action is more perfect? Man's or God's? So Rabbi Akiva says, of course, man's action is more perfect. So he says to Rabbi Akiva, he says, what do you mean? Could man create heaven and earth? So how can you say man's action is more perfect? He says, I'm not talking about it. I'm saying whatever is within, which has relevance to the human being's action is more perfect. He says, I'll give you an example. You plant the seed. Its kernel grows out of the ground. So even though the kernel may be edible at a certain level, but if you take that kernel and you mill it and turn it to flour and turn it into dough and put yeast in it, and you bake it into a bread. Which product is more perfect? The finished baked product or the kernel that comes out of the ground? Of course, the loaf of bread is more perfect. So you see that what he contributes to existence is more perfect than what God gives you raw materials. But the ultimate is to take that and bring it to a perfect level. So Thomas Strauss says, he says, I got a problem. If God created the human being with a foreskin, what are you mutilating the child? What are you cutting it off? So Rabbi Akiva says, you don't get it. We just finished saying, God created the world imperfect. The objective of man is to perfect God's world. The foreskin is what? Is the imperfection. We remove it to perfect ourselves. That's an impediment. So Reb Chaim HaKadosh goes to explain, what didn't Turnus Trumpets get? He didn't understand it. He says the reason why he wasn't able to grasp it, and he didn't understand the analogy to the loaf of bread, because what difference does it make? Because he didn't believe in God. This whole concept of spiritual forces, and you have certain abilities, spiritual channels, and impediments. He didn't understand that. How does removing the foreskin, how does that contribute to the perfection of man? The kernel turning into a loaf of bread, we understand. The other we don't understand. This is the Orach Chaim HaKadosh over here. And therefore we find, Gemara tells us in Shabbos, that any mitzvah that the Jews always gave their life for, were willing to die for, that mitzvah is still prevalent among the Jewish people. Which mitzvah did the Jews always give their life for? Circumcision. Whenever the government would decree, if you circumcise yourself, you can be put to death, Jews, they always circumcise themselves, even at the risk of being put to death. Why? And therefore, as a result of that, the Gemara says, Jews, still, regardless of how detached they are from Judaism, they still circumcise themselves. Idolatry, Jews always gave their lives for not to be idolaters. And that's why among Jews, majority of Jews are not pagans. They believe in God because they gave their life. Anything you sacrifice for, there's a special divine assistance that you're still connected to that level. So it's milah and believing in God and not following paganism for that reason.
Rabbi.
Good.